when we're looking at the international and national implications and perspectives on cybersecurity, the concept of cyber war arises. And an overarching question for me and for other researchers is when nation states are involved with malicious activity online, when is a breach a crime and when is it an act of war? We've talked about the threat spectrum and the fact that we began with cybersecurity problems from young people online doing mischief, and we've gradually escalated the nature of the threat and the severity of the threat to include organized crime and nation states. This has been a process over the last 20 years, and frankly, I long for the good old days because the complexity of the questions that we're facing as nation states have discovered cyberspace are daunting. And so this has been an escalation of the threat spectrum, and I'd like to focus primarily on the implications of nation-state involvement. In the context of looking at nation-state involvement, there are three concerning trends. One is the fact that we have placed critical infrastructure online, and what are the implications of that? The fact that we're experiencing disruption of traditional communications, and what are the implications of that? And finally, we're facing growth in devices that are connecting to the internet, and we call it the Internet of Things, where everything from your refrigerator to your lawn sprinkler to handheld devices are now connected to the internet, and what are the implications of that? The fact that critical infrastructure is online introduces a new vulnerability. I go back to the old days when infrastructure, the grid, water infrastructure, was standalone, and I can recall having worked on energy management systems and not had an easy time getting into the facilities that we were building. And fast forward a number of years, and now we have connected infrastructure online, potentially providing access to anybody that can figure out how to intrude. I don't mean to make it sound that it's simple, but it certainly is possible. And you can read online of incidences where those kinds of intrusions have happened and the consequences. So in the context of nation states having access to the internet and occupying cyberspace, critical infrastructure can be an irresistible target. You only have to think back to old World War II movies to know that the targets of adversaries were, and they did include critical infrastructure. If you can destroy the homeland, destroy infrastructure, you have military advantage. And when we talk about disrupting traditional lines of communication, you're talking about the ability to disrupt society and seed chaos. What happens if one of those infrastructures that you intrude and take out is the communications infrastructure? What about 911 facilities? These have been disrupted by online mischief makers in the last few years, and it is a concern. Again, when we smash our information, our industrial age infrastructure, and we rely on the internet to connect us and help us communicate, we also smash the traditional ways that we communicate. We break up chain of command. We break up silos where we have structured communication that we've been used to having and experiencing. We disrupt the separation of sectors of society that have tended to be isolated from one another, and we introduce disruption to communication that can seed chaos. or create what I would call the Tower of Babel effect. What does that do to society? What would not accessing the emergency phone lines do to a society that expects a response to, in this country, a 911 call? And now we look at the Internet of Things. We have an exponential growth in vulnerability as we introduce new devices to the Internet. This gives us new risks to consider. We have the potential of creating the erosion of trust, because we certainly know that we're inviting third parties, Internet service providers, intermediaries that we don't control to have access to our information. And what does that do? What happens when software is developed in another country and we upload it automatically to a device? How are we screening that software for problems? How do we know when updates and upgrades happen? What happens if there is a problem? How do we look at our trusted providers? How do we preserve trust in an environment like that? And then we are going to be creating exponential growth of data, because all of these devices that we're putting online, whether they're medical devices, whether it's our Fitbit, whatever it is, create new classes of data that could be vulnerable, that could identify us. And then, of course, there are the privacy implications. So what should we expect of the Internet of Things? We know that trust must be earned and that we run the risk of the death of secrecy. We have the ability to leverage new forms of data to enhance that data, or are we going to be hindered because we are concerned about the privacy implications of the data that collects? There's two sides to that. We have a more intimate relationship with the grid and with our devices. There was a movie that came out not that long ago that created a romantic relationship between the lead actor and his mobile device. I mean, we are merging humans with machines. And what does that mean? What does that mean to privacy? What does that mean to the way we relate to our environments? And so we're experiencing the escalation of the threat spectrum at the same time that we're experiencing these additional trends. And they're all coming together in an interesting, I hope not, but what may appear to some of us as a potential perfect storm. We're now seeing massive internet outages. I've provided links to a couple that have occurred that have gotten attention. We saw segments of the internet go down in the United States. We've seen segments go down in other countries around the world, Estonia, Ukraine. What are the implications of that? We had massive Amazon service outages. Cloud services are being relied upon more and more by multiple entities. And what are the implications of that? From the university's perspective, we lost access to our learning management system. It became the equivalent of a digital snow day. Who would have thought it? When snow reaches certain intensity in certain parts of the world, classes are canceled. What happens when the internet is out and you're relying on the internet to provide you with online learning? So there are strategies that are being developed to address the issue of how do we defend ourselves digitally in cyberspace. And we're seeing that emerge. NATO, the U.S. Department of Defense, and others are coming out with strategies for how do we know when a war condition exists. We've talked about cybercrime. We know what cybercrime is: stealing money from banks online, extorting people online, grabbing their information, ransomware that seizes people's computers and requires a payment to release the system back to the individual. But what about this growing possibility of a cyber war? We're seeing that cyber components of armed conflict are increasing. How do we deal with that as we are a society wrestling with unintended consequences of how interconnected we become?